Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wanda, and I am part of the Natural Science Society. I'll be introducing Dr. Ian Locke. Ian is the Principal Lecturer at the University of Westminster for Biomedical Science. His first degree was BMS, and his PhD was in protein biochemistry, wound healing. Ian will be speaking about how to pursue a career in scientific research and how to navigate postgraduate opportunities.
Okay, thanks. I'm not normally in need of amplification. As they're getting feedback, I'll leave it in the corner, but if anyone can't hear, speak up and I'll pick it up at the time, against my better judgments. Anyway, so it's always a bit nervous being the second one on because there's also the possibility that Sarah may have trumped me with everything I was about to say, but fortunately I think they actually follow on quite well, and I'll endeavour not to do the same thing to Helen, so we'll see how things move along from there. My brief is basically to talk a little bit about research, really, and the role of the biomedical science research, what you can do with a biomedical science degree going into research, and indeed the various routes into research, because research is not something that really sort of sits on its own. It overlaps into clinical practice, it overlaps into the pharma industry and other sorts of industry, and in some cases is a sort of a relatively standalone career path. So we'll work our way through sort of some of the possibilities and how things work along. So most of you, I'm guessing, are final year biomed. Yeah, this is usually the point that people start to think about, actually, I've got to get a job in the near future. They better actually start attending careers events. So as sort of people approaching their final year, I'll take you back about 3 years or so, 2 or 3 years, okay? You just got your A-levels, you got your university place, all wide-eyed, working back in, not quite sure what was coming at you, but hey, you'll go and do a biomedical science degree, okay? So you decided from your A-levels that you're going to move on to do a biomedical science degree. When you get there, of course, you get into your course, hopefully you're all enjoying it. Most assuming you've got your way to the 3rd year, you're probably still enjoying it, which is always a good starting point. So we're now looking at the point where halfway along, yeah, you're still enjoying the biomedical science. Other things might have sort of captured your interest along the way. Yeah. Unfortunately, the academic studies do need to be pursued. So you've probably got along to the point now, or you will have in a few months, all being well, where you'll be genuine 100% biomedical scientists. Or at least you'll have a biomedical science degree. As Sarah's just said, and as Wendy's going to deal with later, there are other steps before you can actually use the title biomedical science in its proper sense. But for those of you that choose to follow that route, that time will come. At the moment, in about 2 or 3 months' time, you're all going to have bits of paper in your hand wondering what's the next step, and we're basically back to that point again. Okay? So, however, it's not all that bad. Okay? For some of you, that might still be an option. Okay? There may still be a rock star working amongst you. If there isn't, the advice is sounded quite happily on this t-shirt. Okay? Sarah's already mentioned that you're doing one of the most flexible sort of degrees that we have, and actually, it's a very good point. I'll come on to that in a moment now. Just in case anyone's interested, by the way, I was just looking. These t-shirts are available. I have no association with the company. I wish I had after putting these sites up, but never mind. But they are all available, and there's more besides. So if you want to be proud of your profession, I'm sure Sarah will take this back to the institute as well. They're all available, okay? So, how employable am I? The good news is very, okay? Your biomedical science degree gives you a wide range of skills, as Sarah's already mentioned. And those can be skills specifically related to the subject. So you are, or will be, biomedical science graduates. You will have the skills necessary, or part of the skills necessary, to become a biomedical scientist, should that be the career you want to take. You also, of course, can use a biomedical sciences degree as a general sort of biological sciences degree. So there are many careers that require a degree in the biological sciences field that equally your BMS degree is perfectly suited for. Okay, so that's another option to you. And as Sarah said, there are areas that you can go into, like accountancy, people go into all sorts of management roles and all other things, which have no direct requirements on your knowledge of cellular pathology, hematology, or whatever, but what they're after is your graduate skills. Graduate skills are something that tend to sort of seep in under the radar as you're going along over 3 years. Okay? They're not necessarily the skills that you might be examined on in terms of your knowledge, but they are skills that you will have picked up on the way, like team working when you're doing practicals with other people, learning to present things, presenting reports orally, verbally, and same thing really, verbally and or in writing. Yeah. So it's all about extra skills that you've got, attention to detail, use of assorted software packages and so on, that you can take out to a completely different field should that be your your intention at the end of it. And there will be some of you at the end of your biomedical science degree who never want to see a lab again. It always happens. It's usually quite a small percentage, partly because the subject is so interesting. That's my opinion anyway. But there will always be a small percentage that don't want to go into using the scientific aspects of their biomedical sciences degree, in which case that's absolutely fine. You can use it for other things. I think a way to sort of illustrate this, and I stress that these stats are just drawn from a random average on, I just rang around a few friends and got the first destination stats from their university, okay? So first destination stats are something that are taken 6 months after individuals graduate. And students are basically asked, or ex-students are basically asked to indicate what their employment status is. Okay? And you can get this information broken down from different universities, different courses. So this is an average of about a dozen biomed first stats, okay? So about 60% of biomedical science students enter employment. Okay? Now at this point that's employment general, so that would include accountants, biomedical scientists and virtually anything else. About 23% go into further study. Okay? About 9% report themselves as not being available for work, and what that means is that for some reason they're not actually looking for a job at the moment. It may be that they're off on a gap year, it may be that they have family commitments or whatever. Okay? And only about 8% of biomedical scientists, biomedical science graduates, are still looking for employment 6 months after. Now, as I say, this is a rough skit from about a dozen or so universities taken on average. If you look at the individual universities within that, normally the top two kind of remain between them about that same level. They kind of move up and down a bit. Sometimes there's a few more in employment, sometimes there's a few more in training. And the bottom two figures are fairly consistent. Okay? So the figures from your university, wherever it may be, are probably going to be something similar to that. So the good news is that compared to a lot of other courses that people may come out with, you're onto quite a good career prospects to start with. So now you've got your degree, or you will have your degree shortly. What do we do now? The most important point is what interests you. Okay? As a graduate, you will know, or hopefully you have some idea. There are always some people that don't know what they want to do at the end of it. But there will be some who have an idea of what they want to do, or at least they certainly will have an idea of things they don't want to do. If you hate figures, don't become an accountant. It's not going to work, okay? Equally, if you hate science at the end of your degree, don't become a biomedical scientist. It's not going to work. The most important thing about your career is what's right for you. And that's not what's right for your mates, or what your parents tell you, or what your brother and sister tell you. It's about what you think is going to sustain you, probably for a fair chunk of the rest of your life in terms of interest and things. So it's quite a big decision. So what interests you? What's important to you? And when I say what's important to you, that can mean things like, is it important to you that you've spent 3 years gaining all this biomedical science knowledge? Is it important to you that you use it? If that's a major driving force in your life, then you should be looking at a career as a biomedical scientist, for example. Okay? Job satisfaction. You know, it's all very well going and doing something in the city and making hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. If you're not actually enjoying it, will that £100,000 make up for it? It might do. On the other hand, you might actually be someone that needs to feel that the job they're doing is worthwhile, that they're actually contributing in some fashion. Work-life balance is important to some people. You know, if you have, say for example, family commitments, you may be looking for a job that is not going to keep you there till 11 o'clock at night, or that's not going to drive you on shift work. Again, these are also things you need to. Salary is often usually a no-brainer. That will feature at some point, but you may decide that you're prepared to trade perhaps a slightly lower salary for a job that you get more satisfaction from. Okay, so these are all things that you need to. Location can be important. Okay? Some people may want to stay in London. Some people may not want to stay in London. Some people may want to go up to Glasgow. You go where the jobs are if that's what you want to do. Okay? So, the biggest question probably is, can you enter the career of your choice with your current qualifications? Now, fortunately, if you're all on IBMS accredited degrees, you can certainly become a biomedical scientist in due course, and you can use that for others. Those of you that perhaps may not be on accredited programs, you may need to think that what your career options are for that program, one of which is probably not being a biomedical scientist, unless you take the supplementary education that Sarah touched on and that Wendy's going to deal with later. Okay? So the first question there then is, can you do the career with your choice of skills? If not, can further study enable you to do that? Okay? So is there an MSc that you can take, for example, that will convert you into that area? Is there, if you're going in for a purely research career, should you be looking to move on to a PhD before you can do that? There are lots of options, and it's all very much an individual choice. By all means, talk to your careers people. By all means, talk to your lecturers, talk to your friends and your family. But when it boils down to it, the choice is yours, and you need to be confident and happy in that choice that you've made. So one of those choices that I've been asked to talk about is research. Okay? It's kind of difficult to actually define research as a single entity, as I said, because it overlaps with all sorts of clinical things, all sorts of industry-related projects. But there are kind of distinct pathways that you'll need to follow with it. And again, we're at a question that only you can answer if it's right for you. Okay? However, there are some tips that I'd give you, some things to think about. First off, do you enjoy lab work or bench work? Okay. If you don't, then a career as a bench research scientist is probably not your cup of tea. If, for example, you quite enjoy computer work rather than bench work, you might be listening to something in the bioinformatics side or the data mining side. That's a possibility. Okay. Did you do a final year project? I'm assuming that anyone here, certainly on an IBM's accredited degree, did. Okay. And one of the best questions is, did you enjoy it? For most people, their project is their first experience of something akin to research. Some of you may have done little summer projects working with academics at your institution or elsewhere in companies. Again, that's a useful indication as to whether you're going to. If you didn't enjoy your final year project, do not go into research. You will hate it. If you did enjoy your final year project, then you've probably got the mindset and the sort of way of thinking that actually would work quite well in a research environment. Do you like to work independently? Or are you one of these people that likes to be told what to do? If you're heading down a research sort of passage, you need to have, at least at some point in the future, confidence that you can develop the ability to work independently. If you go on to a PhD, for example, for the first year or so, yeah, you will be given more and more guidance, but you're expected to develop slowly into essentially an autonomous scientist. That's the whole idea of a PhD, and then later processes, okay? So there will be guidance. You will have a supervisor or a project leader, but a lot of the decisions you will need to make, certainly over your career time, yourself. So are you capable of working independently? Do you enjoy problem solving? It's a very important point when you're talking about research sort of areas. Okay? Do you have good technical skills? That's, of course, good technical skills in the area that's most applicable to whatever area of research you want to go into. It's like anything in this world. If you haven't got the skills for it, then you're probably going to struggle with it. The ability to extract information, use databases, literature sources, bring out the things that are important, and not just sort of a download of everything that's on the database, but what's important from the database. Can you look at information and decide if it's useful? That's an important point. And the last, are you good at keeping records? That's also important. But the last one, probably the most important, is are you resilient and not easily discouraged? Okay? Research is one of those areas where some days everything will go great, and you will go home smiling and happy, and there are other days when you want to shut yourself in the cold room and lock the world away. Okay? Research goes in swings and roundabouts. Sometimes everything works, sometimes it doesn't. And one of the important marks of a research scientist is someone that can bounce back afterwards and think, okay, that didn't work, that's probably why it didn't work, right, let's try it this way. Okay? And then when it doesn't work again, you go that next time, and so on and so on. But okay, so you've got to be able to actually keep sort of working your way through things. Another thing about the research thing is there is no such thing as any single route into research, okay? There are lots of them. And this diagram shows probably the main ones that I could convincingly get on a slide without creating a spaghetti junction that no one could follow, okay? So obviously you guys are sort of starting up in this corner here with your undergraduate degree in biomedical science. From that point onwards, where do you go if you want to follow a research route? And at the end of the talk, I'll finish with 3 illustrations of people that have taken different routes through into essentially research or a research-linked career. But for the moment, an obvious thing is you could go into employment, or you could go into further study. That's the 2 options that really face you at the moment. And in terms of research career, either one of those is a perfectly acceptable route. Okay? Some people elect to try and get the academic stuff out of the way first. So take perhaps, depending on your undergraduate package, if you've come out with a good degree, you could perhaps go direct onto a PhD program. Otherwise, if you want to change area slightly, or your undergraduate degree is perhaps not quite what you had hoped for, you might want to go through a master's route. Okay? Now that could be a taught master's, like an MSc, or a program like an MRes, which is basically a mini sort of PhD designed to prepare you for research. We'll talk about those options a little more later. But equally, you could go through employment, and then, as Sarah mentioned, in some of those, you could perhaps take an MSc whilst in service. You may even be able to take a PhD whilst in service. And that's not, of course, not just in biomedical science, as in the pathology discipline. That could be within a company environment, in a pharma industry or some other area. Okay? But kind of centrally, if you want to take research on as a major part of your career or as a major career process, at some point or other you're probably going to get as far as taking a PhD. And after that you will go on to various postdocs. Now that postdoc could be in academia or it could be in industry. And certainly in the early career they're more or less the same. And then after that you would, so if you were to continue with that, you would perhaps progress further down the line into a principal investigator sort of role, which is someone that sort of directs the projects and so forth from there. Okay. Now you could be that at some point people will switch from industry to academia and vice versa. That happens. Okay. It doesn't tend to happen so much going from, say, for example, a junior postdoc in academia into a senior position in industry or vice versa, but you often sort of transfer at the same sort of levels. Okay. And that happens all the time, people, I think. So you've got plenty of different routes that you can take in. So if we look at sort of a comparison really of the two main areas, either academia or industry, if we look at it first at sort of like a junior postdoc level, so these are people who will have their PhDs, okay, and this is their first sort of role as an independent scientist, if you like. So at a junior postdoc level, they're actually very similar, okay, because what essentially the individual is doing at this point is using their scientific skills that they've gathered throughout their PhD and indeed their previous qualifications to perform a set task on a set project. Okay, so that project will be usually designed or controlled by a principal investigator of some nature. The postdoc will usually take some ownership. This is a huge bullet point, but I decided it worked best as one. But we'll work our way through it. Okay, so the postdoc will normally take some ownership of the project, but the control will still actually be in the hands of the PI. What it does mean as a postdoc is it's your first chance really to sort of independently start to direct the research, to move a project down a certain area. And you may move it one way and it doesn't work, so then you try moving it to another way. And what you'll typically have is regular meetings with the PI, and you'll sit down and discuss your results, and they'll say what they think, and they'll tell you what you think they ought to do next. You can argue it out with them, see which way it works, and that will come through eventually to a sort of level. And perhaps that level of flexibility is perhaps a bit greater in the academic environment rather than perhaps in the industry environment where there are more how should we say, time constraints and money constraints on the projects in many cases, which will actually lead you to do as you're told, basically, rather than have a huge level of input, especially at this junior level. Okay. If you're in academia, certainly as your first postdoc, there will be an expectation that you start to generate data that is publishable, okay, or presentable at conferences. And again, this is good for you because it starts to make you, as an independent scientist, in your own right, with your name at the top of papers and so on. Okay. Another advantage, if you like, in the academic side is generally if you're working on an academic postdoc, it will be for a fixed term grant, usually 2 or 3 years, sometimes 4 at the outside. But you're relatively confident that the money will be there for 4 years and you will go see that through to the end of the project. In industry, depending if the requirements of the company change, projects can be pulled at shorter notice. In which case it may be that an individual can be reassigned to a different project, or it could mean that they're made redundant if their skills are no longer required in that whatever other projects are running. Okay, but generally they run the same sort of level. Academic postdocs are nearly always on fixed terms, as I said, 2-3 years. Industry, maybe fixed term, maybe permanent. Okay, so industry does have the odd advantage in some places. If you move up to the next level, the sort of senior postdoc level, this is where you start to see some distinct differences between the two areas, really. So certainly on the academic side, a postdoc at a senior level will be expected to have a lot more input into the design of the project. They may even be involved in writing grant applications to get money in to continue the project or to take the project in a slightly different direction. In industry, it's less likely because the money's probably coming from an internal source. Okay? The postdoc will generally take greater ownership of the project and will self-directing in both environments. That's what happens at the senior level. In academia, again, you've got this requirement to publish. In industry, it's probably more focused on generating intellectual property and patents and things that the company that you're working for can actually use in the long run to make money or to have some advantage over their competitors. Okay, so the publishing side, you don't tend to get as much published from an industry postdoc as you do from an academic. In academia in particular, senior postdocs tend to look after junior postdocs and PhD students while the PIs are away writing grants and doing various other tasks. Senior academic postdocs are still in academia, are generally sort of short-term contracts. And this is one of the drawbacks, if you like, of research in an academic environment, is that every 2 or 3 years you'll be looking for where the next amount of money is going to come from. That may involve you changing institutions, it may involve you applying for a new grant yourself or working with people in it in different areas within the same institution. Okay? Either way, in industry, there's usually a greater likelihood of permanence. So when you move up to the dizzy heights of the principal investigator, in academics, we're talking basically lecturers or above. In industry, we're talking sort of team leader level or above. And the academic PI's main job is essentially getting money in, okay, in order to employ more postdocs and more PhD students and drive the project forward. Okay? So grant applications, project design, all those sort of things. They are probably also going to have significant jobs in teaching or maybe administrative tasks, running departments, things like that. Okay? In industry, their main responsibility of the PI is essentially management, okay, to make sure all the bench scientists underneath them are doing what they're supposed to be doing, pulling their weight. They may be involved in grant applications, but that's less common in the industry environment. Most of that's coming obviously from the company that's funding them. Again, you have the same sort of expectations as a senior postdoc, expectations to publish, or in industry to focus on generation of IP and patents and things like that. In both sectors, PIs are generally permanent staff, so you finally get off the 3-year postdoc cycle, whether you're in academia or in industry. One of the routes that we just mentioned is the route into research is through postgraduate study. Okay? And there are lots of options that you might want to consider. And one of the first questions therefore, I guess, is why would you want to take postgraduate study? Okay. Firstly, you can is to specialise further in your area of interest. You have all got biomedical science degrees, or many of you have got biomedical science degrees, which is actually quite a broad degree. So you might want to choose, you actually want to specialise in cellular pathology or immunology or molecular biology. So you might want to take a dedicated master's in that area. And that will help to hone your career perhaps in the way you want to go. It might be that you want to change area entirely. Okay? So as biomedical scientists, we do some basic pharmacology, but not much in depth. So if you suddenly decide that actually you want to go into sort of pharmacology-based research, you might want to go and take an MSc in pharmacology or an MSc in neuroscience or something like that, which takes you sort of out of your comfort zone a bit. In many cases, you may want to take either an MSc or an MRes to prepare for a PhD. Okay. You're doing it largely to make yourself more marketable, whatever reason you're doing it for. Okay. It could be that you're looking to improve the grades from your undergrad if you didn't get perhaps as good a first degree as you intended to. It could be that you want to move into a more in-demand area by taking an MSc that points you in that direction. So these are all things that can make yourself more marketable. It could be that they are requirements from your professional, statutory or regulatory body, okay? That you don't perhaps meet the requirements, for example, for the IBMS. If you haven't got an IBMS accredited degree, you may want to take study either at a postgrad or an additional undergrad level to meet those requirements. It may be in many of you actually, if some of you are already in employment, that you're taking these to improve your current employment position. Okay, so maybe to gain a promotion, like Sarah mentioned, in terms of moving up the bands, or maybe your workplace has changed its priorities, or maybe it's looking for a certain area, wants to develop staff in a certain area, so they may wish to fund you to take that area. So you might want to change your activities. And quite a few people take masters just for personal interests, or at least additional modules. Okay. So all these are sort of what I would consider valid and quite common reasons for a postgraduate study. So when we look at the sort of qualifications that are open to you, one of the first levels, qualifications is perhaps not quite the word, but many people will take individual modules. These may be at undergraduate level or they may be at postgraduate level. Sometimes they're taken just for personal interest, and sometimes they're taken, for example, to meet top-up requirements by the IBMS. Kind of the next level up from that are PG certs, postgraduate certificates, postgraduate diplomas. These are usually available as exit awards from a full master's program, but more commonly now people are actually starting to take them as target awards. So if they know they want to build up, say, 3 modules worth of stuff, they might as well combine it into a PG cert rather than taking individual modules. And it tends to be for that sort of purposes, for updating knowledge or for personal interest, that sort of area. Probably the more common postgraduate route would be the MSc and things like MAs and MBAs if you're looking perhaps to move more to a management side of things. And your MSc, MA, MBA, typically 180 credits at level 7. So if you remember, your undergraduate degree is level 4, 5, 6. Masters is level 7. Okay? And then on top of that, you've got the next step up, which is level 8, which is PhDs and professional doctorates. The other qualification I'll mention here, because they're becoming more and more common, is the MRes. MRes is slowly gaining ground. It was once looked upon essentially as a route into an MSc, into a PhD for training. Some people are taking them as individual standalone sort of research qualifications. Again, it's the same level as a master's, it's the same sort of credit bearing. The difference being where the Masters is largely taught, the MRes is largely research, as the name suggests. Then you've got the PhD, which is basically a 3 years period of research into a certain area. And something else that Sarah mentioned, the professional doctorate, or the D.Prof, which is similarly a level 8 doctorate level award. It tends to be taken part-time by people that are in service in some fashion. There is a sizable taught element, usually about 120 credits, and then a chunky research program of some nature, which basically makes up the rest of the 540. So it's a route that often is taken more by people in employment. It's not something you would probably take as a standalone full-time award, but it's there as a level 8 qualification that people take. So a quick skip through the 3 types we've just mentioned, really. An MSc, usually full-time or part-time. If it's full-time, it's usually done in a year. If it's part-time, it's usually done in 2 years, but part-time routes can take longer, depending on how much you want to study at a time. It is quite intense, especially as a full-time program. Okay? One of the misconceptions of MSCs is that people think, oh, it's just like a degree, but it's only a year, so it's going to be easier. It's not. Okay? There is quite a jump from undergraduate level to master's level, and you've got to get all that in 1 year. Okay? So they're not an easy option. They are quite an intense period of study, but they can get you the qualifications that you need. Classifications of master's levels are a bit different to undergraduates. They're generally classed as a pass mark, which incidentally is over 50. So you've got to get 10% more than you had to get in your undergraduate. It's another little hurdle to remember. Depending on the institution, some also have definitions of merit or distinction, which are over 60, over 70. Some have only distinctions, some don't have anything other than the pass at all. Okay? Depends on the institution. Most taught courses, but they will include a research project which will be bigger than your undergraduate one. Typical entry requirement is probably a 2-2 in a closely related area or a relevant area to it. Okay? Sometimes 2-1 depending on how in demand the course might be. It's generally the courses are much smaller numbers than undergraduates. Yeah, master's programs are typically 20 students, something like that. So demand can be quite high and competition can be quite high for these programs. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but they're not kind of the size of a lot of undergraduate programs. So the MRes is very similar, full-time, part-time, 1 year, 2 years. Again, this is quite intense. Again, the same sort of classifications, but in this case, the taught component is really small, typically about 40, maybe 60 credits. And that's usually a module on research methods, followed by perhaps a couple of specialist subject modules to bring you into the area of your project, and then a big project. Okay. Typical entry requirement, again, 2-1, more often a 2-2 in some cases in this. But the thing here, it's not the same as a normal sort of qualification entry route. What normally happens here is you actually agree with a supervisor beforehand. Some places have advertised projects, but in many cases they're agreed on an individual basis with the supervisor. Many times you actually have to write a research proposal as part of the application process. So you're very much gearing towards a period of research in a specific area. Okay? So essentially it's an individual course between a researcher and a student and a researcher of some nature. Okay? The next step up from the MRes is the PhD. Okay? What does a PhD entail? That's the most honest answer. Okay? A lot of work. PhD full-time, 3 years at least, maybe 4. Most cases part-time are sort of double that depending on how much time you're putting in. And it's quite an intense period of focus, because you're actually working on an individual project, on an individual area, very much specialising yourself in that area, which you will then hopefully take on and use those skills later on to do a postdoc or whatever in that area. There are 3 sort of steps with PhDs, and one of the most common things you'll notice that people often register for an MPhil stroke PhD. Okay? And an MPhil is kind of a halfway qualification of a PhD. So what we basically do is around 18 months through the PhD, you will go through a transfer viva, where you basically have to prove that you've done something in the first 18 months. Okay? So you'll produce a report of the data that you've gathered, things you've learnt, some kind of background research area, and then you'll have your first oral examination. PhDs are conducted by oral examination and a thesis writing. So you write something that's probably not dissimilar to your final year project, perhaps a bit smaller as your transfer report. And then you will have an oral examination, typically for an hour, for that sort of area, in this as the transfer viva, where you will be quizzed on what you've done, make sure it's your work, that it's genuine, and so on. And at that point you then transfer to the PhD full, where you have to produce the full thesis, which is typically a book about that sort of size, thickness, and then you will have an oral examination, which is usually at least 2 hours, with 2 people quizzing you this time. Okay? One of which will be an internal examiner from your institution. The other will be an external expert in the field brought in from any other university that happens to be, that has the individual with that expertise. Okay? So at the end of your PhD, you are deemed to be an expert in your field because you have shown your data, defended it to other experts in the field, and they welcome you into the PhD club, essentially. So that's part of the process. Typically for a PhD, you'll either require a first or a very good 2-1 to get in, or one of those perhaps, or maybe a 2-2 plus a good master's to bolster up the thing. There are a few routes in. There are variations, PhD by publication, which we'll talk about as one of the examples at the end, where individuals spend their life doing research, produce lots of papers, but haven't actually got around to doing a PhD. And you can, in some cases, submit all those papers with a kind of a narrative document, and you can go into a PhD through that route. Okay? So, as promised, these are just 3 examples of different ways into research. If you were paying attention at the start, when my introduction was made, you might recognise this first case. Okay? So, a start's very similar to most of you. O-levels, A-levels, B-Techs, whatever, okay? Similar entry requirements. Then a BSc, it was in biomedical science. Then a PhD. Okay, so this is the straight academic route through, if you like. Then 2 periods of postdoc. Okay, so yes, I had to change course in there. Although I stayed at UCL, I went to different environments, different departments. Again, simply because the funding ran out. Most of these projects are funded for 2 or 3 years. So move on after one to the next. Okay, and then I moved into, I was fortunate enough to get a lecturing position, and then I've remained in academia teaching and running my own research group from that point forward. Okay, so that's the straight academic route in, if you like. This is more the employment-based route. Okay, so again, same sort of entry point, O-levels, science A-levels, okay. And this individual entered employment as a junior MLSO, okay. In those days, biomedical scientists were called medical laboratory scientific officers. Okay, same post, different title. As a base level MLSO, he continued to work his way through the process, okay. Took an HND in biomedical science, then moved on to a qualification that doesn't exist now in that form, but there are similar professional qualifications, as Sarah pointed out with the institution. The IBMS Fellowship, which is where he specialised in cellular pathology. Okay. Then his career path took him drifting towards management, so he took a few management type qualifications. Then an MSc, and then he gained his PhD by publication, because during this the years from once he started as part of biomedical scientists, he was lucky enough to be in a laboratory environment where there was a lot of research going on around him in the hospital. Okay, so essentially he developed his research as he went along, and then moved through and got his PhD at the end of it. But the route, as you can see, is still more or less the same research area. So the final one is an individual that went through the same starting point, okay, then an HND, then a BSc. Now he went out to work in a totally unrelated area. Okay, he went to work for London Docklands Development Corporation, okay, after coming from a biomedical science background. Okay, he's actually looking at fishery stocks, I believe, in the Thames. Okay, it was a research post. From that, he then went back into education, did his MSc, then went on to do a PhD, then moved to the research assistant post, and then to a senior postdoc, okay, research fellow at UCL, then a senior research fellow. Then he tried a year of lecturing as a sabbatical cover, but actually discovered that his first love was remaining as a bench scientist. So he's now gone back to being a bench scientist. Okay, so you can move around in research. That's my point, I guess, from these 3 different points. That's kind of where I'll finish, just with a final word on research. Okay, from a far better scientist than I. Okay, knowledge isn't truth; it's just a disagreement. You agree with me, I agree with someone else. We all have knowledge, but we've not come any closer to the truth. Because you can never understand anything by agreeing or making definitions, only by turning over the possibilities. That's called thinking. If I say I know, I stop thinking. As long as I keep thinking, I come to understand. That's the way I might approach some truth. And that is in very sort of verbose language, but that is actually the process of research. You try one thing, it doesn't work. You come back, you try another way, it doesn't work. You come back, you try another way. You talk to people, you discuss things. Someone might have a bright idea that you can feed into your work. Someone might publish something very similar and you need to move in a different way. And that's essentially the research process. And I'll leave you with Einstein's, well, purportedly his favourite photo of himself. Okay? Thank you. Any questions? If not, I'll deal with them later.
Does anyone have any questions for Ivan? Ian?
It's all right, I'll answer to anything.
I just wanted to clarify, if you get a first an undergraduate course, can you go straight to a PhD?
Yes, in some cases, but basically you need to, as you move through that sort of route, with a first, certainly start applying for PhDs if you see any that are interested in you. Okay, they're competitive, so there's a possibility someone might have a first and an MSc, and they might come along and trump you. But there's no harm in applying for it. You're unlikely to be selected if you've got a 2-2 or perhaps even a low 2-1. You've got to be looking at a high 2-1 or a first. But yes, a number of people do go into that route.
Thank you.